blinking thing you want to. Yes, and a fine lot of good that does me. Just talking over the same old things with the same old crowd, while you have all sorts of interesting people coming in to see you at the office. Interesting. Cranky old dames that want to know why I haven't rented their dear precious homes for about 7 times their value. Bunch of old crabs, panning the everlasting daylights out of me because they don't receive every cent of their rentals by 3 GM on the second of the month. Sure, interesting. Just as interesting as the smallpox. Now, George, I will not have you shouting at me that way. Well, it gets my goat the way women figure out that a man doesn't do a darn thing but sit in his chair and have lovey-dovey conferences with a lot of classy dames and give 'em the glad eye. I guess you manage to give them a glad enough eye when they do come in. What do you mean? Mean I'm chasing flappers? I should hope not at your age. Now you look here. You may not believe it. Of course, all you see is fat little George Babbitt. Sure, handyman around the house. Fixes a furnace when the furnace man doesn't show up. Pays the bills, but dull, awful dull. Well, you may not believe it, but there's some women that think old George Babbitt isn't such a bad scout. They think he's not so bad looking, not so bad that it hurts anyway. And he's got a pretty good line of guff, and some of them even think he shakes a darn wicked walkover at dancing. Yes, she spoke slowly. I haven't much doubt of that. When I'm away, you manage to find people who properly appreciate you. Well, I just mean, he protested with a sound of denial. Then he was angered into semi-honesty. You bet I do. I find plenty of folks, and doggone nice ones, that don't think I'm a weak-stomached baby. That's exactly what I was saying. You can run around with anybody you please, but I'm supposed to sit here and wait for you? You have the chance to get all the sorts of culture and everything, and I just stay home. Well, gosh almighty, there's nothing to prevent your reading books and going to lectures and all that junk, is there? George, I told you I won't have you shouting at me like that. I don't know what's come over you. You never used to speak to me in this cranky way. I didn't mean to sound cranky, but gosh, it certainly makes me sort of get the blame because you don't keep up with things. I'm going to. Will you help me? Sure, anything I can do to help you in the culture-grabbing line. Yours to oblige, G.F. Babbitt. Very well, then. I want you to go to Miss Mudge's New Thought meeting with me next Sunday afternoon. Who, which? Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge, the field lecturer for the American New Thought League. She's going to speak on cultivating the Sun Spirit before the League of her Higher Illumination at the Thornleigh. Oh, punk. New thought, hashed thought, and a poached egg. Cultivating it sounds like why is a mouse when it spins. That's a fine spiel for a good Presbyterian to be going to, when you can hear Doc Drew. Reverend Drew is a scholar and a pulpit orator and all that, but he hasn't got the inner ferment, as Miss Mudge calls it. He hasn't any inspiration for the new era. Women need inspiration now. So I want you to come, as you promised. 4. The Zenith branch of the League of the Higher Illumination met in the smaller ballroom of the Hotel Thornleigh, a refined apartment with pale green walls and plaster wreaths of roses, refined parquet flooring, and ultra-refined frail gilt chairs. Here were gathered 65 women and 10 men. Most of the men slouched in their chairs and wiggled, while their wives sat rigidly at attention. But 2 of them, red-necked meaty men, were as respectably devout as their wives. They were newly rich contractors who, having bought houses, motors, hand-painted pictures, and gentlemanness, were now buying a refined ready-made philosophy. It had been a toss-up with them whether to buy New Thought, Christian Science, or a good standard high church model of Episcopalianism. In the flesh, Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge fell somewhat short of a prophetic aspect. She was pony-built and plump, with the face of a haughty Pekingese, a button of a nose, and arms so short that despite her most indignant endeavors, she could not clasp her hands in front of her as she sat on the platform waiting. Her frock of taffeta and green velvet, with 3 strings of glass beads and large folding eyeglasses dangling from a black ribbon, was a triumph of refinement. Mrs. Mudge was introduced by the president of the League of the Higher Illumination, an oldish young woman with a yearning voice, white spats, and a mustache. She said that Mrs. Mudge would now make it plain to the simplest intellect how the Sun Spirit could be cultivated, and they who had been thinking about cultivating one would do well to treasure Mrs. Mudge's words, because even Zenith, and everybody knew that Zenith stood in the van of spiritual and New Thought progress, didn't often have the opportunities to sit at the feet of such an inspiring optimist and metaphysical seer as Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge, who had lived the life of wider usefulness through concentration, and in the silence found those secrets of mental control and the inner key which were immediately going to transform and bring peace, power, and prosperity to the unhappy nations. And so, friends, would they, for this precious gem-studded hour, forget the illusions of the seeming real, and in the actualization of the deep-lying veritas pass along with Mrs. Opal Emerson Mudge to the realm beautiful. If Mrs. Mudge was rather pudgier than one would like one's swamis, yogis, seers, and initiates, yet her voice had the real professional note. It was refined and optimistic. It was overpoweringly calm. It flowed on relentlessly without one comma till Babbitt was hypnotized. Her favorite word was always, which she pronounced always. Her principal gesture was a pontifical but thoroughly ladylike blessing with 2 stubby fingers. She explained about this matter of spiritual saturation. There are those. Of those she made a linked sweetness long drawn out, a far-off delicate call in a twilight minor. It chastely rebuked the restless husbands, yet brought them a message of healing. There are those who have seen the rim and outer seeming of the Logos. There are those who have glimpsed and enthusiasm possessed themselves of some segment and portion of the Logos. There are those who, thus flicked but not penetrated and radioactivated by the dynamis, go always to and fro, assertive that they possess and are possessed of the Logos and the metempsychos. But the word I bring you, this concept, I enlarge, that those that are not utter are not even inceptive, and that holiness is in its definitive essence always, always, always wholeness. And it proved that the essence of the Sun Spirit was truth, but its aura and effixion were cheerfulness. Face always the day with the dawn laugh, with the enthusiasm of the initiate, who perceives that all works together in the revolutions of the wheel, and whose answers the strictures of the soured souls of the destructionists with a glad affirmation. It went on for about an hour and 7 minutes. At the end Mrs. Mudge spoke with more vigor and punctuation. Now let me suggest to all of you the advantages of the Theosophical and Pantheistic Oriental Reading Circle, which I represent. Our object is to unite all the manifestations of the new era into one cohesive whole: New Thought, Christian Science, Theosophy, Vedanta, Bahaism, and the other sparks from one new light. The subscription is but $10 a year, and for this mere pittance the members receive not only the monthly magazine, Pearls of Healing, but the privilege of sending right to the President, our Reverend Mother Dobbs, any question regarding spiritual progress, matrimonial problems, health and well-being questions, financial difficulties, and they listened to her with adoring attention. They looked genteel. They looked ironed out. They coughed politely and crossed their legs with quietness. And in expensive linen handkerchiefs they blew their noses with a delicacy altogether optimistic and refined. As for Babbitt, he sat and suffered. when they were blessedly out in the air again, when they drove